Loading. Welcome to Access the Animus.
Hello everyone and welcome to a new video here on Access the Animus. In the 5th episode of our analysis of Valhalla's context and story, we're going to follow Odin in his journey to what we believe to be a very important Isu city in order to turn Juno's plan aimed at stealing the 7th method of salvation into action. In the video, we'll show what Odin actually did in order to deceive and trick all the Isu standing on his path and later steal the 7th method, as he met both Jupiter and his daughter Minerva and a number of other Greco-Roman Isu. We'll also discuss several references to the lore established in the past games of the franchise, the most relevant of which involved none other than Ezio Auditore himself, and towards the end, we'll have a look at a different kind of connection to another area of Valhalla too. That's once again a lot to discuss, so don't blink and keep following us. This is how Odin deceived them all for his own interest and that of the Asgardian Isu. We pick up where we left off, with Odin embarking on his quest to find gifts in order to trick both Jupiter and Minerva as planned with Juno. For the former, he did find the quote-unquote cauldron, whatever that actually was, that Jupiter had rightfully won in a bet with the Isu Aegir. This object had apparently been stolen by a group of people that supported the war against the Asgardian Isu and who despised Aegir, who, in their eyes, despite being a Greco-Roman Isu, gravitated too much towards them. For Minerva instead, Odin got what is represented in a Norse mythology layer as Thor's bridal circlet, and in the next video of this series we'll see how he used it to gain her favor. Odin then reached Utgard, the main city of the Jotunheim Arc, which bears a question we already touched upon in our previous video. Which city of the Jupiter-led side of the first civilization does it represent? An immediate answer could be Eden, as it's the most famous Isu city associated with the Greco-Roman Isu and Assassin's Creed in general, but as we mentioned in part 4 of this series, we believe otherwise. This is the city where Jupiter, Minerva, and Juno ruled their fellow Isu, which contained a vault that, as we'll see, contained the testament to all 6 methods of salvation, along with the technology for the 7th, so it's more likely that this could be the city positioned over the Grand Temple shown in AC3, which indeed acted as a repository for the 6 methods and was located close to Turin, New York. The city atop the Grand Temple was in fact shown in the ending of Assassin's Creed Revelations as it got wiped out by the Toba catastrophe. More specifically, the final video of the ending in Revelations showed this triple statue of Minerva, which, in Jupiter's message to Desmond, was directly connected to the Grand Temple through a cylindrical vertical tunnel. So, the city we see as Utgard in the Jotunheim Arc was likely to be an important Isu city built atop the Grand Temple of Turin, New York. Yeah, Odin did travel pretty far from the supposed home of the Asgardian Isu in Norway. After infiltrating the Isu city, Odin finally found Jupiter, here represented as Suttungr. It is very easy to see that this character represents Jupiter, both because he looks pretty old and especially because of his huge belt buckle, the very same worn by Jupiter in Assassin's Creed Revelations. Odin presented himself and right away offered the quote-unquote cauldron as an initial step towards the ending of the hostilities between Asgardian and Greco-Roman Isu, another element to support that the cover-up for his actual mission was a potential peace treaty between the two sides. The ruse worked, and Jupiter started trusting Odin, which also prompted him to ask for the chance of meeting Minerva, here represented as Gunnlodr, who is confirmed to be Jupiter's daughter. The prospect of Odin convincing Minerva to leave her work for a moment and join Jupiter in the so-called feast organized for their guests also pushed Jupiter to trust the Asgardian Isu even more. Eventually, Odin found Minerva in her working place, possibly a lab of sorts, and this is where it's actually easy to understand that Gunnlodr is actually a representation of Minerva, even before meeting her. In fact, her workplace contains several documents written by her, the first of which is roughly centered upon her refusing marriage proposals by other Isu because she is too focused on her work. The other three, instead, are journal notes that detail what specifically she was doing and her observations about her own work. In the first one, dubbed Entry 37, she discussed the Nornir and how it is established in the Norse mythology that they have already spun the threads of fate for everyone, which are therefore fixed. By following these countless threads, Gunnlodr's self-imposed work was to find one of them that did not lead to Ragnarok. As we already mentioned in our analysis, in the allegory the Nornir represent the calculations done by the Isu, and the first part of the document represents a piece of lore that has been established at least since Assassin's Creed 3, that is the attempt by the Isu to use the calculations generated by a device called the Eye in order to find, amidst countless potential futures, one that would allow them to survive the Toba catastrophe. As shown in AC3, the Isu were not successful, so they moved on, but Minerva kept on trying and eventually started using the Eye to quote-unquote speak, that is, to send messages through time in some of the various potential futures she observed through the Eye, in order to help the humans that would have lived centuries and millennia after her avert the return of a catastrophe similar to the one that the Isu would have experienced. This is exactly what we see in the second part of the document, where Gunnlodr/Minerva seems already resigned that the catastrophe will take place and as such has already moved on to try and help those who might come after her. Entry 72, haha, very funny. Entry 72 of Minerva's journal shows the moment where, at last, she received an answer to one of the messages she sent to one of the calculated potential futures. Sadly though, it was a very brief moment, meaning that even in that occasion, her work proved to be unsuccessful, and thus she had to eliminate the potential calculated future and move on to another one. Entry 91 sees Minerva gaining even more success, with the technology here called Cider, another word for magic, being able to hold a communication channel with the potential futures. Minerva wasn't able to see who was at the other end of the channel, but she didn't care. She had to deliver her message, hoping that someone would heed her words. And eventually that happened, but when Odin reached her in the Isu city close to the Grand Temple, she had not been that successful yet. When Odin met Gunnlodr/Minerva, she actually discussed her lab and the technology she was using. We can even clearly see that the fractured glass wall that she is facing has the shape of an eye, in order to show that she was in front of the eye, as in the device that provided the calculations, another proof that this took place so very close to the Grand Temple of Turin. Minerva explained to Odin that after seeing that all the potential futures led to the Toba catastrophe, Jupiter stopped using the Eye and considering it a viable method to save the first civilization, confirming what Juno had already stated in Assassin's Creed 3. Thus, when Odin met Minerva, she already was the only Greco-Roman Isu who kept using the device in order to at least save the future generations. More specifically, she told him she had already left some messages here and there and had even received some answers. Before leaving for the meeting with Jupiter though, Minerva tried to show Odin how the process would work and tried to see if she could get an answer, and the following dialogue is like a love letter to longtime fans of the Assassin's Creed franchise. In fact, Minerva talked to the Eye and called for a prophet, the same name used by Minerva in Assassin's Creed 2 when referring to Ezio Auditore. In the Jotunheim arc and in the calculated future she used when Odin was with her, Minerva did not get an immediate answer, so she decided to move on and to reach his father along with Odin. But the final moments of this scene show a voice coming from the Eye asking, "Who are you?" Once again a huge reference to Ezio Auditore, as those were the exact same words he spoke when he first saw Minerva's hologram in Assassin's Creed 2.
Who are you?
Thus, Odin and Minerva traveled to Jupiter's palace, and in that occasion they had a very long and interesting dialogue. At its beginning, for example, Minerva confessed that the other Greco-Roman Isu did not know or care about the impending catastrophe that they were going to face. The dialogue also provides more context as to when these events are happening. As a matter of fact, it is stated that all methods of salvation from the catastrophe have failed but one, the seventh method. Minerva also said that she knew about the seventh, but that she was hesitant to use it because activating would have meant, quote-unquote, defiling our well of knowledge from which all of Midgard drinks. Reading between the lines, this means that Minerva believed that using the seventh method and thus transferring Isu minds and conscience in the human DNA to be carried across time would ruin the DNA itself, described as the well of knowledge that Midgard, that is the humans, is drinking from. In other words, Minerva was stating that adding the Isu minds to the human DNA would very likely course correct the history of mankind itself, bringing chaos at the very least, if not more. And looking at what the Aita sages Eivor, Sigurd and Basim did, she wasn't that wrong. In general, Minerva was adamant not to use the seventh method, even if that meant to sacrifice all the Isu, but surely other people like Odin and Juno thought differently. An important stop of Odin's and Minerva's trip was the Vault, which we hypothesized to be the Grand Temple of Turin, New York. Minerva even sort of confirmed it, stating that that was where the Greco-Roman Isu kept their greatest discoveries. At the end of their trip, before reaching Jupiter, Minerva pointed at a tower located at the top of the city, where the Jupiter-led Isu used a lot of magic, meaning they concentrated a lot of their technology. This is potentially the tower that was used as part of the first method of salvation, which, as we mentioned in our previous videos, aimed at containing the energy of the solar flare that would have caused the Toba catastrophe, a tower that would have later been abandoned by Jupiter and Minerva. Eventually, the two reached Jupiter and the quote-unquote feast ensued, with Jupiter forcing Minerva to stay and enjoy her time there. After gaining the trust of Jupiter and Minerva, Odin also addressed the other Isu that had gathered in the palace, possibly to be able to move more freely and achieve his secret objective. At this event, as we mentioned in our previous analysis video, Odin also noticed that the Greco-Roman Isu used humans as slaves, as also stated and shown in other locations within Jotunheim. Some other interesting events happened at the quote-unquote feast. For example, Odin noticed a person that seemed Loki but that absolutely refused to say it was him. Spoilers, it was him. What's interesting to notice here is that Loki called himself Thok, which in the Norse mythology is the name that Loki adopted when he disguised and then refused to weep for the death of Odin's son Balder, whom he himself had killed, both in the Norse mythology and in the Isu story, as we mentioned in our first video of this series. The myth had it that Hel, the ruler of the realm with the same name, had agreed that Balder would have gone back to the living if all things in the world wept for him, but Loki, disguised as Thok, did not do that, forcing Odin's son to stay in Hel. While this may just look like part of the mythological veil, some of these events surrounding Loki and Odin's son may hold some truth in the Isu narrative as well, as this story is also told by Eivor to the Native Americans she finds in Vinland. Back to the so-called feast, Odin also witnessed a Greco-Roman Isu complaining that two of her brothers died in the attack on Asgard while Jupiter was throwing a feast for their opponent's leader. All in all, Odin partook in several activities during the event organized by Jupiter and eventually was able to have the vault, meaning the Grand Temple, opened. He then darted inside to fulfill his secret mission and sadly, that's all the time we have for today's video. Yeah, we're also adding cliffhangers to our videos now, that's a thing. Seriously though, what do you think of our interpretation of this part of the Jotunheim arc? Do you agree or disagree with it? Let us know in the comments below. Also, keep following us, as in our next video we'll complete the analysis of the Jotunheim arc, having a look at what Odin really found in the Grand Temple, his final fight with Loki with some interesting revelations about his son Fenrir, and especially the final sacrifice by Odin and the explanation of the seventh method of salvation. If you enjoyed this video though, please consider liking this video, subscribing to our channel and turning the notifications on so you won't miss any of our future updates and analysis. Thanks for watching and we'll see you in our next video.